Imagine a young king, ravaged by leprosy, yet with a will of iron that neither pain nor the Saracens could break. Today, we dive into a little-remembered but decisive episode, the Siege of Ascalon, the coastal city that would become the last bastion in the south of the Kingdom of Jerusalem before Saladin's fatal blow in 1187. Baldwin, the leper king, faced not only his devastating disease, but also a web of internal conspiracies and the constant threat of the rising Muslim power. Even with a weakened body, his mind remained as sharp as a sword. He was the one who commanded strategies, organized defenses, and more importantly, upheld the hope of a fragile kingdom, cornered between the desert and the sea. But why was Ascalon so vital? What role did this city play in King Baldwin's military and political maneuvers? And how did he manage to turn a simple siege into a masterful diplomatic and defensive move? Stay with us until the end to discover how this nearly forgotten moment can reveal the depth of political vision of a doomed yet never defeated king. In the 12th century, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem found itself in a precarious position. Founded after the First Crusade, it lived under constant threat from neighboring Muslim states, especially Egypt and Syria, unified under Saladin's command. To the south, the city of Ascalon was a key piece on the strategic board. For centuries, it had served as a gateway for invasions from Egypt. Although captured by the Crusaders in 1153, its geographical position remained sensitive. With Saladin expanding his influence, protecting Ascalon became vital, and Baldwin understood this better than anyone. In the heart of the 1170s, Baldwin IV had already proven to be an uncommon commander. Diagnosed with leprosy since adolescence, his reign was constantly threatened, both by external enemies and by internal disputes. But there was one city that symbolized more than just a geographic point. Ascalon, the coastal fortress in the south of the kingdom, was the shield against Egypt, the link between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean, and the final line of defense against Saladin. Ascalon had been conquered by Baldwin III in 1153, and the Crusaders had transformed it into an imposing bulwark. But over time, the city also came to represent a point of vulnerability. In 1177, after Baldwin's brilliant victory at the Battle of Montgisard, where Saladin was surprised and defeated on the plains south of Ramla, it became clear that the Mamluk Sultan would turn his attention to Ascalon, the last major bastion before the road to Jerusalem. The siege of Ascalon that concerns us here was not a typical siege, with enemy armies knocking at the city gates with battering rams and siege towers. It was a political and diplomatic siege, subtle but decisive. Baldwin knew that the city was vulnerable not only to weapons, but also to internal divisions. The threat came not only from Saladin, but also from the noble factions of the kingdom, which vied for influence over Ascalon and its resources. Around 1183, Baldwin ordered the city to be reinforced. Even with his weakened body, he traveled to the outskirts of Ascalon to personally oversee the defensive renovations. Chroniclers, such as William of Tyre, recorded that the king, despite being frequently immobilized, actively participated in military decisions, guiding engineers and commanders. He knew that if Ascalon fell, the road to Jerusalem would be exposed. The king also understood that Ascalon needed to be in trustworthy hands. It was in this context that he decided to entrust its guard to the then Count of Tripoli, Raymond III, an experienced nobleman and, at that time, still an ally of the crown. Baldwin also involved the Templars and Hospitallers, ensuring that the city was garrisoned by disciplined military orders. While Saladin gathered forces in Egypt, probing for weak points in the south, Baldwin anticipated his moves. In 1185, there are records of skirmishes around Ascalon. Saladin's troops tested the defenses and raided nearby villages. The Crusader response was swift and organized, led by lords loyal to the king. This coordinated reaction was a clear signal. The invisible siege around Ascalon would be met with strategy and moral resistance. At that moment, Baldwin was already aware that he would not live much longer. His leprosy had worsened to the point where he had to be carried on a litter and could no longer wield a sword. Even so, instead of succumbing to despair, he used Ascalon as a symbol of resistance and cohesion. His gesture was clear. As long as Ascalon stood, the south of the kingdom would still have hope. The protection of Ascalon became for Baldwin not just a strategic objective, but an almost spiritual mission. Over the following years, the king kept a watchful eye on the city, even as his health deteriorated irreversibly. His ability to govern directly diminished, but his influence persisted. It was as if Baldwin's figure, even from afar, cast a shadow of authority over that wall facing the sea. Internally, however, problems were mounting. The succession to the throne, his sister Sibylla's marriage, the disputes between Raymond of Tripoli and Guy of Lusignan. All of this weakened the kingdom's cohesion. Amid this turmoil, Ascalon remained a relatively stable point, and that was due to Baldwin's prior vision. He had appointed trustworthy commanders and secured the support of the military orders, elements that would prove crucial when Saladin finally decided to strike with full force. In 1186, Saladin launched his definitive offensive against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had assembled a formidable army made up of Egyptian and Syrian contingents and even tribes from North Africa. But the advance was not straightforward. Saladin knew that the south still resisted. Ascalon, with its high walls and active port, could both threaten his supply lines and serve as a refuge for Crusader forces. That is why he tried to besiege it, this time literally. Despite the advance of the enemy army, Ascalon held out. The local forces, reinforced by the Templars and Hospitallers, repelled skirmishes and prevented a large-scale siege. This would not have been possible without Baldwin's prior preparations. Even Saladin acknowledged the strategic mistake of not having isolated the city earlier, as its continued presence forced the Muslims to remain constantly vigilant in the south, dividing their resources and prolonging the conflict. At the same time, Baldwin, nearly blind and covered in sores, had already passed the regency to Guy of Lusignan, marking a bitter turning point. Guy lacked Baldwin's political sensitivity or natural authority. And worse still, he did not grasp the symbolic and military value of keeping cities like Ascalon operating at full strength. When Guy assumed military command, many of Baldwin's careful measures were ignored. The result, the once solid frontiers began to crumble. But why did Ascalon resist for so long, even when the rest of the kingdom was already beginning to fall apart? The answer lies in the preceding years, when Baldwin IV still exercised his power. His insistence on fortifying the city, entrusting its guard to capable leaders, and ensuring the loyalty of the military orders created a core of resistance that endured even after his death. Although the city would eventually be lost shortly after the Battle of Hattin, its resistance significantly delayed Saladin's plans. More than that, it gave time for the last Christian refugees to prepare for the inevitable tragedy. By preparing Ascalon to resist, even after his death, Baldwin offered the kingdom a final hope in the south, a bastion built not only with stones and spears, but with determination, clarity, and faith in the face of death. The siege of Ascalon, even though it never materialized as a major military episode, was a decisive moment of Christian resistance in the 12th century and a reflection of Baldwin's soul. In the face of Saladin's relentless advance and the decay of his own body, the young king did not give in to despair. On the contrary, he turned each city, each bastion, each man under his command into part of a greater strategy. Ascalon, in this context, was more than a fortress city. It was the last hope in the south, a symbol of foresight and steadfastness in a kingdom ravaged by rivalries and disease. Even knowing he would not witness the final victory, Baldwin planted seeds of resistance that would blossom in critical moments. His foresight, his choice of leaders, and his trust in the military orders left a legacy that endured beyond his death. Today, as we revisit this nearly forgotten episode, we are invited to recognize in Baldwin not just the leper king, but a sovereign of indomitable spirit and remarkable strategic clarity. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, share it with those who love medieval history, leave your opinion in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more episodes like this one. See you next time.